I'm very excited to get into the talk. I mean, as you mentioned, I've been in the industry for about 12 something years now. And for the longest time, I've, constantly felt the need to be objective with creativity. And I haven't found it enough. Like when I'd have my managers or the client tell me, I'm not feeling it, or this isn't impactful enough, I really wanted to know what they meant. And so strategists historically have been my BFFs at work. So I've kind of like gone ahead and personally branded myself as a left-brained creative. And I've like as a left-brain creative, I've heard quite a lot of times that creativity isn't subjective, and that it isn't a science. Sorry, that creativity is subjective and that it isn't a science. And while that may be true for some, it isn't true for a lot of like our left-brained creative friends. And there's quite a few of us out there. I've been speaking on this topic, for a few years now, and I've met quite a few left-brain creatives. So it's a great way to kind of connect with like-minded people. And I truly feel that creativity is something that can be learned, and that's what I'm here to talk about. Now, creatives are generally considered right brain, and we know that, but I'm here to tell you that as a creative, you could borrow a little from your left side of the brain to going back to talking about decoding hunches and making sense of our sixth sense. We're what isn't an elusive, jog the right part of your brain. We can learn how to harness it. So I have very strong feelings about gut feelings. At the start of my career, I remember attending a talk by a very famous director. His level of craft and excellence in storytelling is unmatched. Now, always having been interested in the workings of how other people's minds worked and how they, what their work processes were, I mustered the courage to kind of ask him a question. And I asked him, I would love to know what your process is and how do you come up with like your main storyline or the big idea. And the answer I got from him was, I just feel it in my gut. And now, pun intended, the answer left me feeling gutted, because I could not, career. I suddenly thought, could I not harness, will I never be able to feel this gut feeling? A creative is excessively scary. Now, people view creatives as these sentient beings, they're free-spirited and they're banking on the unseen, and always thinking that creativity isn't understood or tangible. And that's why, being a creative is scary, because it relies on one of the most historically unreliable resources of all, which is creativity, that the brain processes and consequently then the gut feels. So the brain is always taking precedence over your gut. Now let's talk about the brain a little bit. So when we get a strong gut feeling, it's actually the nerves sparking in our brain, remembering, thinking, making those connections and deciding on the matter at hand. So we're always pulling information from our brain, and so is our gut. And so that's the reason why I'm a steadfast believer of the gut, of how the gut knows things rather than how it feels things, right? So the gut knows whether it's through experience, that the brain processes, especially like curated processes, formulas, but there's knowledge that leads to that specific feeling in your gut. So now there's this quote by a fellow called Benjamin Braun. He's the CMO of Samsung, and he's spoken exhaustively about this idea. He's even coined a term for it. He calls it gut knowledge. He says gut knowledge is the ability to take a creative decision based on having a lot of facts and information, but letting your subconscious kind of filter all of that data and see through the information. So that brings us to the question, what exactly are these facts and information that a creative processes in their mind that leads to these feelings in the gut? Are there tangible facets that we can glean and learn from these processes instead of just attributing all of this to intuition? And my answer there is yes. The very first thing to do is knowing that the idea lies at the helm of the vernacular, the consumer insight, and the brand vision. So now strategy is the left brain counterpart to creativity, right? So it serves as a foundation of some of the greatest work done in the world. And it's a juggling act. When you think strategically, the best creative ideas lie right at the sweet spot between these three elements. So we're talking about the vernacular, the consumer insight, and the brand vision. So when you talk about the vernacular, this is where you land at the pulse of how your nation, or more specifically, the consumer that you're targeting speaks. So this helps you veer away from, ad speak, or to making whatever your campaign is sound more commercial, right? So you kind of move away from that when you tap into the vernacular. Then there's the consumer insight, which is often uncovered through research, personal experience, or observation. And then there's your brand vision, or the business problem your brand wants to solve, and saying it in a way where it kind of like displays its brand personality. So that's your brand, the way you're saying something, and then your consumer. And these are the three things that kind of come together to form the idea. And that's what your brain pulls from. I'm now going to play this case film for you, and then take you through how we use the vernacular, the consumer insight, and the brand's voice to strike the perfect balance.
Two young women forced to commit suicide, allegedly after dowry pressures.
Every hour, a woman is killed because her family has failed to meet her husband and in-laws' demand for a higher dowry.
In the Indian subcontinent, forced dowry is a practice in which the groom's family coerces the bride's family to pay the groom in material goods. The practice results in thousands of women's deaths every year. This year, UN Women decided to start a movement against this little talked about issue.
Using one of the most recognized symbols of marriages in Pakistan, hands adorned with henna.
Millions of Pakistani women decorate their hands with henna to signify happiness and celebration associated with weddings.
So we use that medium to send across our message: stop jahez khori, stop dowry mongering.
We designed a special typographical treatment that blended with the henna and made special stamps that were not only sent to celebrities, but were also available for download online as a stencil. The campaign became the most trending topic in Pakistan during the wedding season.
Jahez khori.
जहेज
Jahez khori.
जहेज खोरी बंद करो का पैगाम बहुत वाज़ेह है.
Jahez khori
बंद करो.
We designed special posters with our message and decorated them with real henna ink. Consumer goods stores which sell materials that are commonly used for dowries started putting up our message to take a stand.
The campaign prompted the nation's most influential body, the Islamic Council, to proclaim dowry to be un-Islamic.
जहेज इस्लाम में हर दर्जा ममनू है.
Ultimately, our symbol of stop dowry mongering became a cultural icon for a national movement against dowry.
Here, is it the woman, or is it the men that we need to speak to? We realized that the issue didn't lie with the woman who was handing over the dowry, but the men and their families who were demanding it. And so the insight we uncovered was that we needed to hit men where it hurt them the most, which was their false sense of masculinity. And so we turned to the vernacular at this point. What can we say that would feel like an actual insult to them? There's all kinds of abusive terms in our language to describe the wrongful acquisition of money. The word haram khor refers to somebody who resorts to illegitimate means to make a living. The word bhatta khor, for example, refers to someone who extorts money. So similarly, using that second part of those words, which was khor, we coined a new term for the act of demanding dowry and called it jahez khori. Now, if you notice, instead of using the abusive word jahez khor itself, and directing it to a person, we used a word to describe the act itself. And that was because UN Women as a brand is not irreverent, and hence calling someone a bad name or an abuse from the platform would not sit well with the brand. And so we made that small tweak to disseminate the same idea, but doing it in a way that was more aligned to the brand vision and and the So number two here is internalizing your brand's voice. And this was a very important sort of lesson that I learned while I was working on Coke. We attributed personalities to each of the brands, where Coke was the big brother, Sprite was the street smart friend, and Fanta was the mischievous kid that you knew. Once we'd internalized these characters, sketches, the brand's language, both in terms of copy and design, started to come to us very naturally. So instantly, when you're writing copy or when you're thinking of a design, when you have like this sort of character attributed to a brand, it becomes really easy to kind of pull from it, and to know what kind of like brand voice you need to use there. The third point is zig while they zag. Now, this is generally your mind identifying a pattern of like mundane communications that you see around you and knowing you need to go the other way to avoid becoming a copy of them. So remember all of those communications in the pandemic that started with the world is standing still. Now, that's what our gut tends to avoid because our brain tells us that we've heard it before. And there's another neat trick for this. While you're in a brainstorming session, you can use the first 15 minutes of that session to filter out the riffraff by identifying ideas that are kind of recurrent, that a lot of people would be coming up with at the same time. And that's when and these ideas crop up more often, so that there's something that other people would have thought of too. So the more creative angles would lie deeper into the discussion always. Speaking of zigging while the world zags, here's a campaign that we worked on with UN Women, and while all anti-domestic violence campaigns in Pakistan were showing women as weak, we went the opposite way and we flipped the narrative and had strong women ask men to beat them, but at things that they were good at. Just gonna play this for you.
Almost 90% of Pakistani women have suffered some sort of abuse, most of which is justified by Pakistani men who believe that women are weak. To make matters worse, most women believe the same.
They believe that whatever is happening to them is right and they deserve it.
Shockingly, a bill was recently proposed which recommended that men be allowed to beat lightly a woman. Most anti-domestic violence campaigns portray women as weak and beg men not to beat them. So UN Women decided to do the opposite. We showcased powerful women and built the first domestic violence campaign in the world that invited men to beat women, but at things they were good at.
Me with your fists.
Beat me with your feet.
Beat me with your voice.
What first looked like a submissive retreat ended up being a powerful statement that Pakistani women are strong. We then took the campaign directly to the people through meaningful activations and product-specific messages. The campaign went viral on news media. Pakistani women took on the conversation on how strong they were, and men joined in and started tweeting our hashtag in support. The results were astounding. Even the government got involved, and a spin-off campaign is now being created to launch the largest domestic violence shelter in South Asia, and quite the opposite from last year. A new women's protection law is being implemented. Eventually, UN Women took the bold step in not only changing Pakistani men's perception about women, but in inspiring a generation of Pakistani women to stand up to abuse.
तो फिर वो कर सकते हैं तो मैं क्यों नहीं कर सकती?
बहुत मोटिवेशन हुई कि औरतें कुछ भी कर सकती हैं.
Women who now know they are unbeatable.
And this brings us to our fourth point, which is make consumer research your best friend. And in advertising, you cannot distill a great idea unless you land on the pulse of what your consumer's life looks like or what they're thinking. Research, in this case, can look like a lot of things. There's social listening, focus groups, observation. They all play a part in knowing who your consumer is, so you can craft messages that can speak to them. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this slide and go right to point number 5, which is feedback. Know how you know. Now, sometimes you know that an idea isn't working, but you don't know how or why. That's, generally our gut telling us there's something off about this. But and because of that, you hear things like, it's not impactful enough, or I'm not feeling it as feedback. Now, this is an important lesson in both like taking and giving feedback or critique. The fact that you should always keep it objective versus subjective. If it's a logo in question, for example, you can turn around and ask the client, is it the size, the color, the type that you've used, the design style? Objectively work out what would make the design better instead of accepting subjective blanket feedback. Or obviously this works the other way around too. If you have a team that's asking for feedback, always take a beat to understand what exactly it is that isn't working about a specific idea before you go back to your team and tell them what isn't working. The more objective you'd be, the better the work outcome would be always. And then we have point number 6, which is to let it ferment. Sometimes what happens is, you've come up with a great idea, and when you go back to it a day later, it doesn't seem as smart as you thought it did. And, which is why we need to let an idea ferment, like just kind of let it be, come back to it later. And not only like apply your own brain power to it, but, have gate checks with people that you trust within the team. And this is generally like your own manager. You let the idea mature over time, which is why every time we would get a brief, we'd populate the calendar with gate checks. This was something that we did on our own back in Pakistan. We have project managers for that in the US. So a lot of stuff has been taken off my plate, but then there's your initial brainstorm with your team, and then there's a follow-up brainstorm to refine the shortlisted, big ideas that you have. And then you have a check with your manager, or the CCO in my case, to narrow down to the best one, or to resulting in a larger sort of session to craft a campaign around the finalized big idea. And knowing that you have all of these steps lined up, it's all in an effort to kind of refine whatever idea it is that you come up with in that initial brainstorm, and it always helps. Number 7 here is to use organizational tools. And, contrary to popular belief, creatives too can be organized with their working and their thinking. And this, in my case, at least, it helps me maintain chisel focus on, the task at hand, and how I'm using my creativity without, facing so much as like hurdles that come from being disorganized. And so here's a picture of like tools that I've used over the years, starting from like a whiteboard to like going over to the more complicated Miro board that I've used in the past year. But again, all of these things, which are, calendars, checklists, Post-its, and collaborative tools like the Miro, are a left-brained creative's best friend. And these are just some of the tools that my team and I would use on a regular day. I haven't added pinned Teams conversations here because the sight of them triggers me. But yeah, so this is what my day looks like. And yes, so this brings us to the end of my talk, and I'm hoping that I've been able to make this sort of elusive method around creativity a little more accessible to all of you. Creativity is definitely something that can be learned, and I've tried to break it down, and it's honestly all that I've kind of like picked up in my 12-something year career. So I hope it helps all of you too.